Hello and welcome to Dapple Studios. We are really excited to be able to share this video with you, and hopefully you will enjoy learning more about our new lockdown composer technology. I'm known as Abs to my friends, and I'm part of the team that created the composer during the various lockdown spells of 2020. In this video, I will take you through the key features and also share some background info on what inspired us to build a new music making web app. There are lots of amazing DAWs, drum machines, synthesizers and samplers out there, and we didn't want to build another one. Our focus is to help you translate loops and unfinished works into complete tracks. If you haven't done so already, why not sign up for the Composer? The Lite edition is free and you can use almost all features to try out the various techniques I will be covering in this video. So we don't waste too much time up front, I will delve straight into the technology. I will then take some time to cover some of the more advanced techniques, troubleshooting and the general philosophy around the Composer to help you get the most out of the technology. I have assumed you're familiar with DAWs and the electronic music making process. Once you've signed up on the Dapple Studios website, you can launch the Composer using the Composer link. When you launch the Composer, you will be presented with a list of templates. The default ultralight template is the lightest, weighing in at just a couple of megs. We have to consider our friends with smaller bandwidths. Once you have created some tunes and saved your projects, if you need to relaunch the Composer, you can select the default ultralight template and then load your saved projects. Select one of the templates to get started. I was messing around with this earlier using a chunk of the ultralight template. Let me load it and show you. Cool, right? For this video, I'm going to use the deeper template. It's a little less intense and also uses different loop sizes and some intricate transitions which will test and illustrate some of the features more clearly. I will load some different fragments from other templates later in the video to illustrate different aspects of the Composer as well. So here we are, the Lockdown Composer. Let's have a quick listen. You will see a familiar DAW-like environment, but the Composer is actually designed for a slightly different purpose. For the first batch of templates, we have tried to present a consistent setup to encourage familiarity. You will notice a set of layers going vertically, essentially equating to mixer channels. You will also see the sequencer controls at the top. You can use this first row of boxes to set loops. The second strip represents playheads, and you can click these to move around your song and also to resync and restart players whenever they fall out of sync. You can edit the song structure using this icon to enter design mode, and delete patterns to fine-tune your song structure. Along the left-hand side, you will notice two columns of controls next to the familiar mixer controls. The first column represents a set of effects racks, and you can use these to perform and shape your sounds. The second column represents sample categories, essentially audio files that you can import, slice, and manipulate. There are 4 categories. Mixdown, that represents everything, typically your master loop, that is your drop. It may be that this is the only loop you have. You can load this into all 4 sample categories if required. But in this template, we have the mixdown and also the separate drums, synths, and also vocals in a 4-track-like arrangement. We can click on these or any slice on the song structure to open the slicer. So what is this showing us? The slicer shows you the selected sample depending on what you have selected on the song structure. It is color-coded to help you identify the layers of the song it is locked onto. Think of the slicer as a preparation area where you prepare the different parts of your song, and the master sequencer and song structure as the arrangement area where you compose and orchestrate your song. So here I can play this slice and also hear it playing on the song structure in combination with other layers and also passing through the various effects racks. So at the most simplest level, you can identify a set of bars that constitute your loop, and your song structure will use these loops to arrange and play back a song. You can play the slicer and the master sequencer, and they will each stop each other when they are played. Looking at the controls at the top, you can decide how many bars, also known as measures to our friends in some parts of the world I believe. This determines the number of bars you will want your loop to cover. You will also see the playback rate and also a panel for pitch adjustments. One important thing to remember is that the pitch control here is simply applying it locally to the slicer for illustration and tuning purposes. If you do use the pitch shifter for a sample, remember to actually apply it on the appropriate effects rack as well. I will cover this in some detail later. You can therefore apply different pitches to the same sample in different layers of your song. Also remember that pitch shifting is performed real time and it will add delays, so allow for that in your song's composition. If you click on the eye at the top of the master sequencer, you will find details of your song's tempo. You will also see the bar length and this song beat control here. The song beat is duplicated on the slicer and represents the heartbeat of your song. When creating arrangements, it is easier to have a reference point for all your samples and slices. If all your samples are running at the same BPM as your song, then that's great, it's easy to arrange things. But what if your samples are all at different BPMs to your song's master BPM? Once you've decided your song's tempo, you will notice these slice bars. They will be adjusted to show you how much of your sample will be consumed by the song at the given playback rate. You can adjust the playback rate and pitch for each of your samples independently. When you load samples, the composer will analyze the audio and determine the potential BPM. It won't always get this right, but in most cases, especially where you have regular beats, it will make the correct determination. The faint lines you see here represent the beat grid. You will also see slightly stronger lines that detect peaks, points of interest if you will. As you adjust the playback rate, you will notice a second number that shows you the adjusted length of the sample. However, the most important part to focus on is this, the slicer's bar layout. This is based on the song's master BPM and determines how much of the sample the selected slice will consume. The length of each bar will automatically adjust and visually indicate to you just how much of your sample is going to be consumed by your selected loop length. If you know that your various samples start on beat, then the song beat control isn't really necessary, since they will all align properly, even if they're all off beat, but off beat together in unison. However, if you're starting at different points and BPMs, then it's useful to ensure that they all roughly match the song's heartbeat, and this can be a very useful utility to synchronize your loops. Later I will also show you how you can fine-tune and also go offbeat in real time to create some cool layer effects and bounce those as new loops. A final point on this is if you know your samples start on beat and match the tempo of your song, then you'll notice the start position of your slice turns slightly reddish. This simply shows the start of a bar in absolute terms based on the absolute start position of the sample. Therefore, if you have some junk at the start, these will be meaningless, but can be useful in certain circumstances. To illustrate how you can match different samples at different tempos to a song's master BPM, I'm going to slow this song down to 100 BPM from 125. As I change the slider, you will notice changes to the slicer bar length, and any lock slices will also warn you that their boundaries no longer match the song's pattern boundaries. You will therefore have truncations, differing speeds on different samples, etc. However, we can alter the playback rate of each sample individually and adjust the pitch if necessary. We can be quite formulaic or play it by ear. Given we have slowed down the heartbeat of our song, we need to perform an equivalent function on the sample. And because our samples are all derived from the same master sample in this example, we can alter them all to 0.8 as a playback rate. That is simply 100 divided by 125. You may notice that the sequencer has figured out that the slices match the master BPM again. I can of course do the reverse. If I increase the master BPM to 140 for example, in this scenario, I need the playback rate of 1.12. That's 140 divided by 125. And this is what it now sounds like, and everything should still transition smoothly, but at a faster rate. Next, you will also see the slices ranging from numbers 1 to 63. What are they? As you slide the waveform, the slicer is slicing away in real time. These slices create 63 variations from your selected loop. Each slice will therefore be a different number of bars, depending on how long your selected bars are. So in this example, here's slice 1. So slice 1 plays the number of selected bars for your loop. This is then progressively sliced in half as you move down the slicer. Regardless of the slice size, a slice will loop for a minimum of 1 bar. The sync mode button here allows you to test the transitions between different slices. There is a separate sequencer in the slicer which will loop for the selected bars. It will then play the selected slice. In sync mode, you can arm the next slice. If you look carefully, the loop is highlighted as progressing in the background in dim grey, and the playhead only loops over the selected slice in this pinkish colour. The next slice will transition at the end of the highlighted bars or at the end of the selected loop size. For longer bars, you can help the playhead along, closer to the transition point. One thing to note is don't try and rewind by clicking the highlighted bars once the loop has passed. It will simply rewind at the start of your playhead without transitioning. In this scenario, let it progress to the end of the loop as a transition step. For shorter loops, you will hardly notice all this happening in sync mode. But this can be useful for checking the looping and transitions between long slices without having to wait. Once you have some key parts of your sample loops identified, you can lock them. The conventional approach and temptation here is to create a series of locked slices and create your song from these. However, this will make your composition quite rigid and also difficult to adjust in future. A technique I use is to label your master loop as a locked slice to remind yourself of the position of the slicer, since it can be easily dislodged as you drag the wave to discover new things in your sample. If you look at this eye here, it will show you all the slice info. Here, for example, you can see changes to the transient slices as I move the wave, but the lock slices are still the same. I can therefore easily reposition my slicer at the correct position when I finish moving around my sample. Therefore use lock slices sparingly. As a result, in this template and most others, you will mainly find numbers which are totally fluid and consist of the variations from the same loop. This means these slices are more likely than not to transition in a smoother and more pleasant manner. So if I loop here, for example, it sounds like this on the song. If I now select a different loop altogether, my song will instantly transform to something different in real time. This can be great for checking different permutations in different parts of your song using different loop sections. It can be a great source of inspiration and great fun, but you have to think of your composition process somewhat differently. A couple of final points to highlight. If you try and exceed the sample length with your selected loop length, you will notice the sample is anchored to the end. The slicer will still provide some slices, but it's best not to compose anything with a slicer in this format. Ideally, reduce your loop length or try and find a longer sample. These volume controls here do not affect the master track, but they can be useful to harmonize the slicer volume with the master sequencer when switching between the two and arranging slices in real time. So that's the slicer in a nutshell. Easy, right? Having said everything I've just said about the slicer, you may wish to throw caution to the wind and rely on slices being randomly chopped and completely offbeat to create interesting effects. We may do this to create a completely different loop that acts as the basis for our song. Okay, I hope what I've covered so far has been useful and interesting, and hopefully inspire you to try and lay down some tracks in slightly different ways. As a team, we are DJs, producers and sound engineers, and we have tried to use a performance-oriented approach to create compositions using a more natural and enjoyable format. Once we have a loop, or the complete song structure, we can loop the arrangement and apply and adjust the effects racks. Each of these blocks in this column represents a rack that is applied to one or more channels, like buses in typical DAWs. You can turn these on and off individually and all together to compare the effects. The first click on this power button will typically turn off the whole rack. You can memorize your favorite settings for the whole rack here. You can then use a combination of these toggle buttons to A/B your composition. The idea here is to add variations and movement in your sounds to keep the listener's interest. Naturally, keep the master rack off until you've completed your mixdown and ready to finish off your track, otherwise you'll get into a bit of a pickle with your mix. One of the cool things you can do is record your performance. In Lockdown Composer, we have looked at automation from a slightly different perspective. How often do you want to jam, and how often do you think, damn, I wish I'd recorded that a minute earlier because my loop's just overwritten it? When you click the record button, the composer creates a linear rendition of everything that you produce and master out. So here's an example. Don't worry about the breaks, clicks, mistakes. We are simply creating new content for our slicer. Once we finish recording, we can review. And the coolest part is that we can replace or add this to any of our samples and reslice, re-record, and go again. Naturally, be careful when overwriting complete samples, since this will destroy your existing arrangement. Composer will warn you and provide details about where you're using the existing sample. Here, I'll just append to the end of the mixdown. So what you've just seen is one method of creating content. You can also load your own samples from your local drive, from remote locations via URLs, and bounce sections of your tune. You can also record from your microphone. All of these operations will let you add additional materials to your samples and then reslice and recompose. I did promise to share some additional technical details with you at the beginning of the video, and I'll cover some of these now. Remember, locked slices are locked. You cannot adjust lock slices once created, even if the slicer says it's transitioning okay. If you change the playback rate, for example, you will need to recreate these slices or adjust the playback rate to match the song's tempo. The slicer locks onto the structure of your composition. You will note this delete icon disappears when lock slices are used in your song structure. You will need to delete the pattern or reassign something else temporarily to enable you to remove the lock slice, then reslice and reassign. The Composer is built on the Web Audio API. Quite amazing technology that enables you to run the whole thing on a browser. We have tried to optimize it wherever possible, but like most DAWs, the audio graph will be pre-created and you will notice your CPU running pretty hot. To keep things moving along nicely, try and keep samples short. The recommendation is no greater than 30 seconds. Also, if you notice obvious breaks between slice transitions in the slicer or the master sequencer when you know they should be transitioning smoothly, then save your work and start the Composer in a fresh new tab. A worthwhile point remembering is that the bounce process uses a different rendering context and batches things, therefore it often smooths out the transitions further since it is not hindered by the interactive screen refreshes. As a result, you may notice that your session is completely locked during rendering. This can also take quite some time depending on what else your machine is doing and the actual specification of your hardware. Just try and be patient here. Under heavy loads, you will notice some of the players may go out of sync and some may not play at all. In most cases, you can simply click on one of the playheads to resync the players. They should also resync at the beginning of the loop if you're looping. If you ever end up in a situation where something is playing when all indicators are off, then you should save your work if you can and reload the composer and your project. This should create a fresh environment for you. And of course, be sparing with the number of FXs you use, since they can easily kill everything. Finally, if you want to do tons of layering, then you can bounce your multi-layered loops and re-import them into one of the samples. All your effects will then be baked into the audio file and reduce the load on your CPU. Now, I also want to cover the mixer, the FX racks, and how they're patched. If you look at the meters here on the left, these represent the mixer channels. The output from each of these pass through the FX rack. This is where you can see another meter at the end of the rack. The outputs from each of the FX racks are patched into the master mixer channel, down here. This in turn then passes through the master FX rack. Therefore, the meter that really matters is this one, here at the end of the master FX rack. Obviously, be careful you're not distorting any channel individually, but the main one is this one. If you run things too hot, Composer will tell you that you're clipping. Never a good idea, as you know. I can therefore adjust these FX parameters, and they will only affect the FX rack meter and not the meter on the mixer. So this sidechaining, this is quite a complex beast, but a necessary and powerful unit if used correctly. We are to assemble it from scratch, and it has some quirks you need to be aware of. If you recall some of the patching details I just covered, and look at the controls for the sidechain effects, the first thing you will notice is that you can use the unit as a standalone compressor or in sidechain mode. When you activate the sidechain mode, you can select this input trigger, which can be another FX rack or a mixer channel. What actually happens with this unit in sidechain mode is it directly receives the signal from the trigger source. You can decide how much of that signal passes through to the compressor using this gain slider. This is actually a real-time signal, and it is this signal that will bear down on the signal for this rack as a whole. So to illustrate this, I will try and use a steady signal, which should enable the sidechain effect to be more noticeable. I was messing around with this earlier using a chunk of the ultralight template. Typically, in EDM setups, you may want to sidechain some of the bass line, for example, using the kick as a trigger. I'll do that here. Hopefully you noticed that with the unit completely off in standard compressor mode and sidechain mode. Some of the quirks to watch out for result from the fact that the trigger signal is directly connected to the sidechain unit. So there's no effect if the trigger is off, but the signal is still received if this channel is muted. Hopefully this knowledge will help you avoid some pitfalls. You can control how the trigger and the target of the signal behave by using the gain in the original signal and also the gain slider on the unit. As a result of this wiring, you will notice a layered effect of the kick. You can minimize this if required by increasing the source of the input signal and reducing it using the gain control on the unit. You can also dedicate a channel simply as a trigger source and put your actual kick on a different channel and let that channel dominate the kick. The downside, of course, is that you're likely to lose a channel just for sidechaining. Hopefully this information is useful. One of the reasons for focusing on this unit, of course, is its importance in electronic music. And just in case you are thinking it's too complicated, let me show you why the effort to master it is definitely worthwhile. You may have seen me messing around a little bit with the master rack earlier. Our aim was to create a self-contained composer that will let you finish a track from start to finish. The master rack provides some useful units that will let you add that final polish to your tracks. Mastering tracks is a complete art in itself and beyond the scope of this video really, but the main thing I would say, and you've obviously heard this many times before I'm sure, is don't just master for volume. Detail first and volume second in my view. What you will find is that many tracks have a natural loudness point after which the characteristics and dynamics of the track start to alter and diverge. So no matter how hard you try, the track will feel distorted, lumpy, and sometimes very hard-edged. The volume meter might show a higher level, but it won't necessarily be any louder. This is the LUFS versus the RMS argument, if you will. In some circumstances, you may want that by design, but in most cases, it's undesirable. Also, depending on where you think your music will end up, most radio and streaming channels will normalize your track's loudness level anyway. You will therefore lose detail by solely focusing on volume, and then lose it again when your track's volume is brought back down before streaming. Having said all that, don't use this argument to be lazy though, and leave unwanted artifacts in your track, which will surface when the listener cranks up the volume. One of the plus points of overcompression and limiting is that it definitely squeezes and forces you to notice the peaks in your tune, preventing the rest of the track from being maximized. This isn't really the same as losing dynamics, but rather identifying parts of your track that prevent other parts shining as a result. The little icon here will play a very short loop. It's not beatbox grade or anything like that, but it will have some of the key characteristics of a clean track. Loudness, stereo imaging, dynamics, subtle compression to glue everything together. Again, we just want you to have something ready to hand to enable you to do a quick A/B of your track instead of having to venture around elsewhere. Okay, so it was quite a long intro, so to speak, and I hope you found it useful. I tried to cover a lot of ground in this video, and hopefully you'll take the time to explore the composer in more detail. As a team, we love all things electronic music related, but unfortunately, we are like dinosaurs at social networking. If you share our interest, I hope you will like, subscribe, and engage with us on our shared passion. You can find us in all the usual social channels, and you can also engage with us via email and on our forum. With that, I'm going to play you out with a fragment of this gorgeous tune. Till the next time, take care.